Hi, comic book fans, and welcome to another suddenlycomics.com video. And we have got a special unplanned episode today of the price variance. And the question we are posing might sound a bit strange, but I think there's some confusion around this. And the question we're going to try and answer is, what is a comic? Okay. So, Alan, I'm going to ask you to define what is a comic.
Well, it has to be different than a magazine because there are magazines that have comics in them, but we don't call them comics. So one thing must be the size of the comic has to be a certain size, either of golden age size or slightly smaller, but not too small because then we call it a digest. And that's another thing altogether. So it has to be within a certain size. It has to be of a certain type of content as well.
Okay.
So if it's too much text, like where it's actually like formatted with text, like just all text on pages rather than images and then text, um, then that would kind of qualify as a magazine. So with all of those in mind, the Garfield that you showed on your channel.
No, no, no. That's not. I'm not going to get to that yet. I want you to define. Okay. Please give me the dimensions.
The
If you say
dimensions.
it's defined by the size, somebody needs to
It's
give
a,
me the dimensions. I have searched and I can find no definition of a comic which has anything to do with the size.
but they always say within comic book format. So even if you look at the history of comics, okay,
Yes.
like Walt Disney is a good example of this. Walt Disney had a Walt Disney Comics and Stories, and originally it was a magazine format. Okay, nobody calls those magazine formats, which were much bigger. They never called it a comic.
Okay.
It was when they actually reduced the size to comic book format that that
Okay.
is
I
referred to
don't
as a
have any
comic.
issues with that. Give me some numbers. What is the size of a
Um,
comic as opposed to a magazine?
so magazines I think are like, is it 11 by 14? I'm not sure. Like, I don't
Okay,
know.
so
I could
so,
grab
so
I could grab I could go
let me
over
just
and grab
let me
some.
just challenge you. Okay, so I have done some research into what is a comic, and I have looked for
Hmm.
definitions all over the place. I can
Hmm.
find no definition that
Hmm.
refers to size whatsoever. Okay,
Okay.
the definition of a comic, according to Webster's and according to all the dictionaries I can find,
Okay.
is it is a bound collection of comic strips, usually in chronological sequence, typically telling a single story or a series of different stories. So that comes back to the point you were making, which I agree with, which is
Hmm.
you know it's got to be uh, illustrations mainly and
Yep.
not text, yeah, and they've got to be
Yep.
in a sequence, usually telling one story or a number of stories, right?
Yeah.
And all the definitions I can find, that is the
Say that
definition.
it's
There is no thing that says a comic is this size and a magazine is this size. So for
Mhm.
example, is that a comic or a magazine? Let's start with an easy one.
That is a comic.
Is a comic. Okay, I will agree with that. It's uh,
Hmm.
it's got a series of panels with drawings in,
Hmm.
and yeah, I think that's a comic. We can agree on that one.
Yeah.
What is that? Because it's not the same size as the one I just showed, and it's got, but it is just full of panels and stories.
So it's one of those things that actually almost is in between because, like,
So
again, this
CGC grade this as a comic, not as a
I
magazine.
would say that's a comic personally.
Okay,
So
so it's not exactly the same size as your traditional comic.
Yeah, but there is like almost a traditional size
I
for
mean,
the
that
golden,
is
silver.
smaller than the Golden Age comic. So the width is
Yeah,
Golden Age comic size.
yeah, but the height is not.
The height is not.
Yeah. So so it's because it's smaller, not bigger than the golden age size, it fits into the comic definition.
Right. Okay. Maybe we're
Okay.
getting somewhere. Maybe it has to
Okay.
be
A certain
smaller than the
size. So it's a
Golden Age
certain
comic
size.
size.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Now then, I'm going to show you something else. This
Hmm.
is Cosmic Comics.
Okay.
It calls itself a comic. It's full of comic
Yeah.
strips.
So
But
that actually is bigger than the golden age size,
yeah, it is.
I'll tell you. Um, and once you get into that size, it's very close to more of a magazine. So what they would say is there's comic book size, and there's always a term, you can almost look it up, standard comic book size. Because like there was actually a thing where in the 30s, they went from magazine format to what's called comic book format. And it was a size difference. It was not like a
Okay. But the
content
problem
difference.
I've got, Alan, is that there's nobody anywhere who's using any size that I can find as a definition. Also, if you go to other countries, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, they produce comics and they call them comics, and they are
Mm-hmm.
not within your size definition a comic.
Yeah. So I collect a comic from Belgium
Okay.
called Spiro.
Oh, that's right. It's the Smurfs one.
Yeah. And it's considered a magazine, even though by your definition, your false definition,
You're the one that's in the dictionaries.
it would be considered a magazine, and it would be considered a comic. I because of the size, it's not just the content format, it is the size format that makes it comic book size. And so that extra level of definition is kind of important. And it was one of the definitions that came out of the golden platinum to golden age, where there was that shift to a comic book standard format, which
You
is I
see,
know it's
I
beautiful.
think you are being driven by Mr. Werther. You see, because when the your Seduction of the Innocent rules came in and we got the Comic Code
Mhm.
Authority,
Yes,
a number of people got round it by saying we're not producing comics, we're
we're
producing
producing magazines.
magazines. But the Comics Code Authority doesn't exist anymore. It has some stupid rules. We don't say it isn't a comic if it's got a vampire in it. We don't say it isn't a comic if it's got a sympathetic villain in it. So we shouldn't accept the silly rules that they had about what size these things were defined as. I think
Mhm.
there is another thing for me, and that is about the length of the story. If it gets to a
Okay.
certain length, I think it becomes a graphic novel instead of a comic.
Yes, yes, I've heard that as well. And
Okay.
also sometimes the bounding as well. Like if
Yes.
it's a comic book, it's more of a soft cover. And if it's usually it's more not a hardbound, but it's like, in
Yeah.
the kind
Yeah.
of
I'm
more
happy to go with both of those. So I think there's something about the length, and over a certain length, it becomes a graphic novel instead of a comic.
Mhm.
And agree with you. If the binding is a book type binding, then for
Yeah,
me, that's more like a book than it is a comic. Okay.
comic,
So
yeah.
we've got quite a lot of common ground, but we still have this problem
Mhm.
with size. And I think it's because you're based in North America, in the American
Mhm.
continent, and you
Okay.
think everything has to be American sized. But the rest of the world doesn't necessarily comply with that. I have
Yeah,
something here. This is a UK edition of this that's calls
but
itself a comic. People would call it a comic, and it's not quite the size that you would like it to be.
yeah, so that's the question then, because like CGC would grade that as a magazine, right?
You think so?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So I'm going to test this out. So my Garfield one. So this
Yeah,
is all started. For those of you who are not aware, this has started because Allan said that the first appearance of Garfield in comics was in Justice League 300, and his first
yeah.
standalone comic title
It's not Justice League, but DC presents.
DC presents 300. Okay,
Okay.
and his own first appearance in his own title was Garfield 1 from about 2008. So I then found this in the UK, and I said, "Yeah, this is earlier than the one you've shown." And Alan said, "Yeah, but that's not a comic; it's a magazine." So this is where this discussion has come from. But I'm sorry,
but it's more of a magazine format because some of it's cartoon, sure. Some of it would be kind of comic book related, but then it has some magazine content.
Yeah, but the illustrations, the comic illustrations, form 80% of it. They're the majority of the comic. The majority of the publication, whether it is a comic. So it would be very interesting. I might submit one of these to CGC and see if they charge me as a comic or if they charge it as a magazine.
So I had something similar from the 80s for Garfield, actually. It looked kind of similar to that. Almost reminds me of the thing that I had, which was a coloring book. It was a coloring book, very similar. Like, so it's
our mate Kyle has got one.
Yeah.
I think the same one you're talking about. It's an American publication, but it's sized similarly to this.
Similar size. And so to me, I think size matters. That's what my wife always tells me. So so yeah, I think that's where the definition kind of lies, because that to me would be magazine format.
Well, I'm not going to
closer to magazine size.
I'm not going to accept this until somebody puts some numbers against it, because you can't say it's size dependent and then not tell me what size it is. Below this, it's a mag comic, and above this, it's a magazine.
Yeah, because like there is I forgot which comic it is. It's like either Famous Bunnies or one of those ones where it was considered the first comic book because it was of a certain size. So I'm going by that. And that's not Wortham. That's before Wortham.
That
was like in the 30s. So so I'm going by that definition. And I kind of, if you start playing with that definition, all of a sudden then there becomes like a whole problem with first appearances. It's like because there's like a whole bunch of first appearances in magazines that are actually comic magazines. Like they're like, just as you pointed out, that they have all the same kind of definitional stuff that a comic would, but they are considered magazine. But all of a sudden, if you say, "Oh, no, those are comics," then all of a sudden everybody's concept of what was the first comic book appearance.
So this is why I think it's important that if size matters, and I can't find anybody who's put a definition together that's got size in it. So if anybody out there who agrees with Alan that size matters, can you please send us an official definition of what size is it? What's above what size a comic turns into a magazine? Because I can't find it. CG don't publish anything that tells you that. Or I couldn't find anything that CGC says that publishes that says that.
Yeah, so I did find what the standard size is. The typical size.
Yeah, okay, but this is just American printing sizes, yeah.
Yeah, is 6.63 inches by 10.24 inches. Like that's such a weird thing. I wonder if that's why, like, I get all these trimmed comics, because it's like, so yeah, it's like such a weird definition, but that's what the standard comic definition. Okay, standard dimension for a comic book is 6 5/8 inches wide by 10 1/4 inches high. Yeah, but then they said there is no laws that this can vary, but I don't know. It's kind of weird.
So, yeah, exactly. So, well, there have been 3 sizes of American comic books, as we know. There was the Golden Age size, the Silver Age size, and the current size. But, there are comics of all sorts of sizes. Alan Class, which we've agreed is a comic, is a different size to those 3 sizes that the Americans used. and
Mhm.
CGC grade this as a comic. Um, so,
So,
let's have some. If size is relevant, and it could be,
mhm.
I have some sympathy with it, but I'd like to know what the sizes are, because I think Mr. Cosmic Comics here would be very upset to understand, 63 years later, 50 years later, that he's not a comic.
Yeah, they should cross that out and just put like magazine. But
I think
actually,
I
according
think this is
according,
pretty borderline between
yeah.
comic and magazine.
So to me, that would be a magazine. It looks more like a magazine. Just the style, like it just sort of reminds me
It
of
doesn't
those.
call itself a comic, and it doesn't call itself a magazine either.
Because
Interesting.
what does it say at the insignia, whatever it's
Yeah,
called,
it doesn't.
insignia
It
or
just says
insignia?
if you would like Garfield to be sent to you.
But does it say like issue 1 of the magazine
No, it
for
says
girls?
per copy. It avoids the word.
It avoids it avoids answering our debate.
It
Um,
does. So
okay, one other thing that I just looked up. Okay,
yeah,
so I'm Googling as we're talking here. I looked up what is the difference between a magazine and a comic. Okay,
yes, okay,
and they say the major difference is size. Comics are smaller while magazines are bigger, like regular drugstore type magazine. That
that's
was
not very useful.
not super useful, but that's the definition that they gave.
According to
Now,
whom?
that according to Google, okay, and that's the difference that CGC gave actually.
It's bigger. Okay, so that's
So
fine.
yeah,
Can you somebody give me some numbers? I'm
yeah,
a scientist. I think just
yeah.
saying it's bigger doesn't really help me in determining whether that is a comic or a magazine. If you give me
Well, I
some
gave you
size,
the crazy 6 and 5
yeah, well,
inch.
that's just a standard size. That doesn't work because that is a comic and it
Mhm.
doesn't fit with the size you just gave me.
Yeah. So that one, I even just looking at it, I feel like it's borderline comic magazine, just because it doesn't. There's a sort of a dimensional thing that I feel like a comic should fit into. Um, so yeah,
Also,
sure.
do you not think this is a bit sort of Americans trying to tell the world how the world is?
Well,
Because
it's not Americans, it's Canadians, because we're the ones that really truly dominate
okay, sorry,
behind the scenes.
the North American continent trying to dictate to the rest of the world their view of the world, because there are plenty of other countries that
Mhm.
produce comics that don't fit in the standard comic American size, and they'll be very upset
Yeah,
that the North
yeah,
American.
yeah. Well, as I said, I mentioned the one
Yeah.
from Belgium that I collect, which is even they consider themselves to be a magazine. So I don't know. I'm just going by what I think. But ultimately, all of this is mute. The debate is mute because the book that I referred is actually earlier by 7 years, almost 8 years. Actually 8 years than
Oh, as the
your
first appearance, yes.
as the first appearance. Yes. So that's all that matters. And then that I'm always right. And that's all that really truly matters. So yeah. And
Oh, but but if this is a comic, this one would hit
then that would be
his
you
first
based on
solo
your
title.
thing, that would be his first title.
Yes.
Um, but yeah, but is the question becomes, is that title actually Garfield?
Well, it calls itself Garfield.
No, 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 no. It says something else.
Inside it says Garfield.
Oh, it just says Garfield. It
If
doesn't
you would
say
like
from the pages of
Garfield
Garfield.
to be sent to you, it doesn't say Garfield with Orson's farm. It's like some of the American comics, they have something else written on the title.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. So I'll
so so guys, what do you think? Does size matter?
yeah.
Are the North Americans trying to tell the rest of us how to run our lives? Um,
Mhm.
if you believe size matters, please write in the comments below exactly what size a comic is and what size a magazine is. And please tell us where you have found this definition, because I probably
Mhm.
will guarantee you found it somewhere in the North American continent. So,
So Yeah, and the other thing we should do is maybe if you imagine you're putting this up on your channel, right? Put
Yeah.
up a poll and say who is right, Mark, who is wrong, or Allan, who is right, and just put that poll up. See which
Yeah, but
gets.
we haven't got anything for you to be right about because you haven't given me a definitive
Well, I
definition.
gave you some numbers. I gave you
Yeah,
some
but those
numbers.
numbers are not correct, are they? Because we know that Golden Age comics don't fit that. Don't fit that. And you're not saying all your beautiful Golden Age comics and magazines, are you?
Well, I said that it's between a certain range. I gave like age range as well. So yeah. Okay.
So the debate rages on.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's
I I I do accept there is probably at some dimension at which I would say this is a magazine, not a comic. Um, but it's probably for me, probably this is borderline. Okay. Isn't this a borderline? It's somewhere around these sort of sizes. But I want somebody to put some numbers on it. I want
Mhm.
somebody to tell me the maximum width is this, the maximum height is this, and then it's a magazine. And it needs to be somebody other than Allan. It needs to be um, some recognized authority or dictionary or international standards agency, um, because I can't find it. CGC obviously use some sort of random internal thing that they haven't published,
Mhm.
um, to determine whether they're going to charge it as a magazine or as a comic. That would be interesting to know. I may contact them and say, please, can you explain to me what the dimensions are of a magazine, or what is
And
the
I'll
max?
share some links with you afterwards. Actually, I found some good stuff as I was
Okay,
Googling because
so
they talk about Conan and a whole bunch of other magazines like mad as well.
this was an impromptu one-off this week. Over on Alan's channel, we'll be being more normal, and we're going to be looking at CGC hottest comics of the year. Okay, so pop over to Alan's channel, and you'll get us being normal. Hope you've enjoyed this debate. That is your lot.